for a variety of reasons. One of which is Barbara's writing a book on this subject. Secondly, Warren is an authority on the subject. And third, the subject is right in our faces every day now. That after all this emphasis on leadership, why are so many people failing at it? I mean, you just go from one field to another. You look at the corporate scandals that we have seen with WorldCom or Tyco or Enron or Anderson. You look at what's happened in the Catholic Church. What happened with Cardinal Law? Why did he go down? Bishop O'Malley comes in here. He's a very different kind of leader, and he's succeeding. What's the difference here? Why is why did one fail in effect in the end, and another come in? Why did Howell Raines? Howell Raines at the New York Times, 7 Pulitzer Prizes, and something goes wrong at the paper, and he holds a meeting of the members of the team, and he finds it's not about what went wrong; it's about him and how people are reacting badly to him, and essentially his followers tossed him out. They forced the publisher of the publication to toss him out. How did that happen? Gray Davis in California. Why? All of us have our own responses to recall, but how in the hell did he ever get here in this position? What happened to him? Where did he go wrong? What is this all about? Now, I think the critical question, of course, is what they themselves do to go wrong. You can tell the arc, and it was so interesting to watch the Dick Grasso arc at the New York Stock Exchange when Business Week had this cover about, what was it, 10 days ago? Last week, the $140 million man who was running, and it's really a $200 million. But when they had a $140 million man, as soon as you saw that cover, you knew his days are numbered. You do not take a cover like that. Well, what happened next? Why did he go wrong? New York Post yesterday. The New York Post always has headlines that you can put up on your wall because they're always so ridiculous, so funny. But anyway, here's a headline yesterday: "Greedy Grasso's disgrace." Classic New York Post. Greedy Grasso's disgrace. So is it greed? Do people just the power go to their heads? Does they lose touch with reality? Is that what brings so many people down? Her followers less tolerant than they used to be. You read Walter Isaacson's book about Ben Franklin, and you know in today's age, Ben Franklin would be celebrated for his virtues, but he would have been really knocked hard on the rest of his life. Or look at what's happened to Jefferson, revered for so long, now knocked from his pedestal by contemporaries. We are much harsher on our leaders than we used to be. Is that what's happening here? Is it the press? Is the climate of the press such that it's very difficult to lead? Would Grasso have survived had it not been for the furor in the press? Interesting question. I know I have friends in the press who will tell you there is a systemic bias in the press toward bad news. That even in Iraq, when we're trying to figure out is Iraq going well or going badly, it's really hard to tell, right? But friends in the press will tell me, look, things go well in southern Iraq, things go well in northern Iraq. They appoint a city council, they get water running in a village. All those things happen the same day. One American is shot somewhere in Iraq. There's only one story that comes out of all that. So is there a systemic bias toward things are going badly? These leaders aren't working well. Those are the questions some of the questions that we want to explore today, and we have this wonderful panel. Barbara Kellerman will kick it off. I've told you that Barbara was the executive director. Before she came here, she has had a long and distinguished career in the leadership field as a scholar, as a writer, as a PhD from Yale. She has a long list of books to her credit. She is now writing a book on bad leadership for the Harvard Business School Press. It's coming toward a conclusion on a manuscript. And she has been a wonderfully successful teacher here in the classroom. So we're delighted to have you start us off. Barbara?
When David and I first discussed this panel, he said, well, you can talk about it.
That's right. That's right.
And he said, in fact, next week we have a panel about why leaders go wrong or how leaders go wrong. And I said, no. I said, the book is still either 6 months or 12 months away from publication, and I'm not really ready to talk about it. So I told this to my colleague Lauren Bennis, who said to me, Barbara, talk about your book, Bad Leadership. So you are my guinea pigs. By the
Speak louder, Barbara.
About the
Yeah.
1,000, can you all hear now? Is it on? Is there somebody who knows how to work this? I can learn about leadership, but I don't necessarily know how to work mics. How about now?
No, try it.
How about now? Warren, let's give the man a hand. He can do two things at once. So gifted. Yes, you are my guinea pigs, not necessarily my 1,000, how big is the guinea pig that lived 8 million years ago on the front page of today's Times, 1,500 pounds. So not necessarily of that size, but nevertheless, I have talked some about bad leadership, obviously. But I am going to speak more about the book in the next few minutes than I have to any group, really. Let me just begin by saying that one of the reasons I undertook a book about bad leadership is because I have been struck, and you would be a good group to respond to this, how the leadership field, as it has grown in the last 10, 20, 30 years, and it has grown, has been incredibly biased toward good leadership. The word leadership often is assumed, in fact, to mean good, and we spend very little time thinking about, we sort of fuss and fume about them, but we don't really study bad leaders, and I don't just mean sort of leaders who are a little bad. We don't spend time, even in schools of government, talking about leaders who are really and egregiously bad, so bad that they can fairly be labeled evil. Now, some people disagree that this is a proper kind of discussion because they assume the word leadership to be good. I do not. I assume that leadership is a purely functional term and that all it means is the capacity of one person to get at least one other person to get from point A to point B. And there are many different ways of doing that, including, as some of my students have heard me say, out of the barrel of a gun. Power comes out of the barrel of a gun, as Mao has said. That's his line. To me, that is leadership, but I recognize it is not leadership to everyone, but it is how I will be using the term leadership, the word leadership, in the next few minutes. So let me begin by reading to you a few pages from the introduction to this book. It is called, literally, Bad Leadership, and the page or so that I will read sets the stage, and you will know what I am talking about. Let me read you the two quotes with which I begin the book, one of which was given to me by a colleague named Sarah Chase, and I am very grateful to her for this wonderful line from William Butler Yeats. It goes, "We have fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair." Leadership without thinking about bad leadership makes our hearts brutal and our minds ignorant. The second line was actually fed to me. You think I did nothing by myself here. I did do a few things by myself. Again, by Warren Bennis, my great colleague. And it is from a book by Clifford Geertz, the great anthropologist. And it goes as follows. Man is an animal suspended, which, by the way, I deeply believe to be true, that we are the human animal, suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. Now, as you will see in a moment, since I call the introduction the tangled web, I believe leadership is a web with different strands flowing through it in ways that are not quite as neat as the spider's web, which is why I call it the tangled web. And I will read you only the first few lines of the introduction, and then I will make one other point. The first lines of the book are, "This book is about the dark side of the human condition. It paints leadership in shades of gray and in black. For all the work on leadership that assumes it by definition to be good, I describe how we exercise power, authority, and influence in ways that do harm. This harm is not necessarily deliberately inflicted. it can be the consequence of carelessness or of neglect. But this does not make it the less injurious and sometimes calamitous. Now, the other thing that I will describe to you about the book is that I do a typology of bad leadership in this book. And in fact, the book centers around this typology. Now, what is a typology? A typology is simply taking a whole group of things, whatever those things are, and breaking them up into different groups or types. Now, when I started to tell people I was doing a book on bad leadership, invariably they would think I was doing a book on really bad leadership. I decided that's not, in fact, what I wanted to do. I wanted to cover the spectrum from the slightly bad to the really bad. So this typology, which is, I think, grist for the mill for anybody who's interested in leadership, because it's to some degree arbitrary, but not, it's based obviously on research, is how I have broken the universe of bad leaders down. And it breaks down into 7 different types. The 7 different types are broken into 2 different major groups. Group number 1 is the inadequate leader. And I will read to you how I define inadequate leadership. Inadequate leadership fails to produce the desired change. For reasons that include missing traits and weak skills, strategies badly conceived, and tactics badly employed, inadequate leadership falls short of its intention. The second big kind of bad leadership, big category, is immoral leadership. So you have inadequate and immoral. Immoral leadership fails to distinguish between right and wrong. Common codes of decency and good conduct are in some way violated, and the leadership process, therefore, defiled. So now what I will do in my remaining few moments is to describe to you the 7 different types. And I will read you their names, and then I will define each of them. The 7 different types of bad leadership are incompetent, rigid, intemperate. They are all in the category of inadequate leadership. Under immoral leadership, I have callous, corrupt, tribal, and evil. Incompetent leaders. Now, before I read you these 7 brief, very brief, each has just a few sentences, I want to be clear. Leadership is not just about leaders. It is equally and at every turn about the followers. It is the most it's not misunderstood because we all pay lip service to followers, but we do not give them adequate attention. We don't get the degree to which leadership depends on followership. None of these bad leaders could have been bad leaders without bad followers. Those bad followers are also of different kinds and different types, and I don't have the room here or the space here or the time here to go into them, but I am reading the term leaders. I'm using the term leaders here, but it is as an exemplar. It is not meant to imply that leaders act alone. Incompetent leaders lack the will and or skill to sustain effective action. With regard to at least one critical leadership challenge, they do not demonstrate the continuing capacity to create positive change. Rigid leaders. Rigid leaders are stiff, unyielding. They may be competent, but they stay stuck. No matter what happens, they hold fast to their views and to previous patterns of behavior. They are unable or unwilling to adapt to new ideas, new information, or to the changing times. Intemperate leaders. Intemperate leaders lack self-control or even self-restraint. Unwilling or unable to moderate their appetites or to keep them confined to private life, they violate conventional standards of good behavior. We move now into the 4 corrupt types of leadership. Callous leaders. Callous leaders are insensitive to and inconsiderate of their followers. The messages they send make clear that followers are a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. Corrupt leadership. Corrupt leaders are dishonorable. Their moral fiber is thin. They lie and or cheat and or steal. To a degree that exceeds the norm, they put self-interest ahead of public interest. The phrase, to the degree that exceeds the norm, is key. Tribal leaders. Tribal leaders are insular. They discount the health and welfare of the other, that is, of those outside the group or organization for which they are directly responsible. Sometimes, as a consequence, many people suffer, and sometimes, as a consequence, many lives are lost. Finally, evil leadership. Evil leaders commit atrocities. They use pain as an instrument of power. The harm done men, women, and children is severe rather than slight, and it can be physical or psychological, or it can be both. More on bad leadership to come.
As an appropriate companion piece, we now hear from Warren Bennis. Many of you know that Financial Times is a newspaper that pays more attention to management and leadership than perhaps any other newspaper published on the planet. And this newspaper cannot get enough of Warren Bennis. About every 3 to 4 months, or maybe 6 months, they run a profile of Warren Bennis. I don't know how many profiles you've had in there. It makes the rest of us jealous as hell. But it's and 2 profiles ago, or maybe it was 3 profiles ago, they said of Warren Bennis that he was the individual, the scholar who made leadership studies respectable in the academy. This past summer, they ran profiles of a number of people who were in the leadership field, and it was called the Guru Series. And every day for about 2 weeks, they would run a piece about a guru. And Charles Handy was in there, and John Cotter, I think, was in there.
Peter Drucker.
What's that?
Peter Drucker was.
Peter Drucker was in there. He knows the list. He can tell you exactly where he played the series. So they had, and for Warren, when they ran Warren's profile, they've been calling us Guru. And Warren's they had Guru of Gurus. I was appalled.
Yes, me too.
It was so wonderful. He's been at this for almost as long as the Kennedy School has been here, right? And he's written a couple of dozen books on this subject. He's one of those kind of people, he writes faster than you can read. There are people like that. He's one of them. And he is, in addition to that, a delightful friend, Warren.
Thanks, David. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, thank you. A friend of mine said about me behind my back that Warren doesn't write, he types, and that's what... Also the word guru, I think it's used by people who can't spell chameleon, but that's another story. It's great to be here, and as a matter of fact, it's very nostalgic in a way, because three falls ago, David and Barbara and I taught a course in this room on leadership and the arts, and leadership, politics, and the arts. Look at the relationship among these three areas. And speaking of art, Georges Braque, the really famous cubist, once said about art that the only thing that matters in art is the part that can't be explained. And to a certain extent, we're dealing in a field that has so many elements, so many fascinating predicaments, and comes across so many disciplines that there is no, at this time, central paradigm. And that's what makes the field endlessly interesting, fascinating, keeps us all puzzled and in doubt, but also keeps us enchanted, because it is contested terrain we're all in. I think it's important to recognize that and to not shy away from that and to face some of the challenges. So, bad leadership, I'm glad Barbara came forward today to talk about her new book, which we're all waiting for the full publication of. Sometime, we're not sure yet, between the spring and the fall, but we are very eager to await that, because it's going to be a landmark book. And I'm very pleased to occasionally be given a chapter or two by Barbara to look at. So, and I think she's also correct about most of the writing, including some of my own, has not been quite hagiography, but has sort of, with the last, I would guess, roughly speaking, until, let's say, 9/11/01, most of the writings about leadership, most of the biographies you saw in bookstores, most of the books coming out, most of the articles about leadership were about or written by CEOs. And they were, and I'm saying that in the last 20 years, and to a great extent, they deserve it because of the incredible resurgence of the economic machine of this country between 1980, say, and 2000. I mean, it's quite a remarkable. And these leaders did deserve the credit, but at times they seem to be these Rushmorean figures that we all held up as objects of enchantment. And of course, time goes around and people do fall from grace. And I think we've seen such an incredible amount of it happening. The cover of The Economist magazine several months ago showed these Rushmorean statues just toppling from the podium or their plinth, and all fallen heroes. And of course the press, as David just said, seems to thrive on that. If it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead, goes the mantra of the 11 o'clock news programs. So, but starting off with the media, in the current issue of Fortune, which I think may be on the stands today, this is a time for PowerPoint, which we don't have, didn't want to use, but it shows the photographs, and it's entitled Time and Punishment. Time and Punishment. It's got 6 leaders before and after they were indicted or did their perp walk. And the pictures are quite remarkable. It shows, of course, Bernie Ebbers, Dennis Kozlowski, Andrew Fastow, Martha Stewart. The camera was most unkind to Martha. I think that's got a lot to do with I don't know, Martha Freud from Schadenfreude. I think they really wanted to get her especially. Sam Waxel and Richard Scrushy of Health South, which is another one, but there are more, and David mentioned some of them. In the same issue, though, of this magazine, this month, Fortune, there is quite a remarkable 5-page article by one of our board members of the Center for Public Leadership's board, a remarkable, exemplary CEO named Bill George, who a year ago, June, stepped down from being the chairman and CEO of Medtronic. Medtronic, for those of you who don't know about the firm, it's a remarkable firm in Minneapolis. During Bill's tenure there, it grew from $1 billion a year to up in the 60 to 70 billion a year. It makes biomedical devices, pacemakers, defibrillators, and a lot of other things that they do. And it's quite remarkable. So in this issue, I just read you the first paragraph of his story. He writes, "Thank you, Enron, and Arthur Andersen, and WorldCom, and Health South. You woke us up. The business world has run off the rails, mistaking wealth for success and an image for leadership. we're in danger of wrecking the very concept of the corporation. It's not often that a business leader, make that a recently retired business leader, gets to sound off in a major magazine. So let's not mince words. Many, many leaders in my generation have failed. That's quite a remarkable statement. And he goes, it's a marvelous article. I think we're very proud to have Bill join our board of the Center for Public Leadership, which I'm so proud to chair. Andy Grove said, the Intel CEO, chairman, former CEO, that he was ashamed to be a CEO given today's news. He said they should be the letters following my name, not CEO, but SOB. That's how he felt. So there's a time for the restoration and to restore the honor of this profession, if we can call it that. But I think it's probably in some ways, maybe it could be a healthy time. The title of our session today is How Leaders Go Wrong from Cardinal Law to Kenneth Lay. I want to change that slightly for my remarks to you. I want to call it How Leaders Go Wrong from Julius Caesar to Howell Raines. David brought up Howell Raines, and I want to try to explain a little bit of what I think happened to Howell, and it fits in with at least one of Barbara's 7 archetypes of bad leadership. I wanted to change the title for 2 reasons. One is to give a bit of an historical perspective here, because we've always had bad leaders throughout history. If you just think about recent American history, we had the Sherman Act of 1890, the Clayton Act of 1914, the SEC Act, which is, I don't know the exact date, but let's say 33 or 4, roughly like that. Certainly in the early 30s. Joseph Kennedy was the first head of the SEC. We've recently had the Sarbanes-Oxley bill. So, and as Barbara's book will show, the idea of bad leadership has been going on forever. We've had so many failures and derailings and stupidities and cupidities and all manner of flagrantly abusive behavior on the part of top leadership. And Barbara raised another question, which must be that there's been some kind of a collusion going on. The reason I wanted to use Caesar is because I have such an enormous regard, talk about bad leadership, in what so many of Shakespeare's plays have illustrated. If anybody has illuminated the darkness around the concept of leadership, it certainly has to be one of the great writers. And certainly none of us can claim to be in that class. Will Shakespeare's plays, especially his tragedies and his history plays. You know, it's amazing about Mr. Shakespeare and how he addresses the timeless issues of leadership, because every time I read him, he seems to have learned more. So, I don't know where this fits in, but I want to just put my experience of following a lot of mainly corporate, but not exclusively corporate leaders, over the last long time. I want to just say what I consider to be perhaps the most common, most fatal flaw, which is arrogance. And by arrogance, I mean not listening, or not. It isn't just not hearing. You see, I think there's this profound differences I want to sort of show you between hearing and listening, and getting, I suppose, and getting. Getting so you really know what's happening around you. When you think about Margaret Thatcher, it's been said about her. It's been Eckert Pfeiffer, who was fired, unceremoniously from Compaq because he had an A list and a B list. And the A list was saying, aye, aye, sir. Yes, sir. And the B list was saying, Mr. Pfeiffer, maybe you ought to look at what's happening to Gateway and Dell. They're kind of doing things that we ought to be aware of. He didn't want to listen to the B list after a while because they were giving him disconfirming noises and news, and he didn't want to get it. Or take Mr. Ivester, who lasted less than 2 years at Coke, because he wasn't listening to the people saying, there's something in that Belgian plant that makes our cans of Diet Coke, something that's kind of got in the water that sort of people are complaining about, and it built up and it built up. And then he didn't get off his executive bottom to go to Belgium. Had he not heard of Valdez and Exxon? I mean, what's going on here? And of course, it had serious consequences, not just for the school children who drank that contaminated Coke, but also for those shareholders of Now let me look at Caesar, and I'm going to relate Caesar to Mr. Raines and others in a minute. Caesar was as Mark Antony said in a play, he was a good man. And he repeated that. It was marvelous that Mark Antony must be one of the greatest pieces of rhetoric of all kinds when he was giving that speech at the eulogy. He was a good man. Well, Caesar was a good man. He knew a bit about leadership, let me tell you. And he knew a great deal about rhetoric. It was Cato who once said that, sorry. He said Cato said when Cicero spoke, people marveled. And when, sorry. I'm sorry. I think I'm okay, don't worry. This is what's called a defibrillator, and it just went off, and it's fine. I'm very sorry for, just getting in the way of this, and I will continue. Thanks. I'm fine. Yeah, thanks.
Tell us what it is.
It's a defibrillator, and whenever your heart gets over a certain rate, it kicks in. And it feels a little bit like someone just kicked you in the back. And you probably saw me, didn't you? Yeah, and I didn't want to scare you because it is a scary thing. And I'm sorry about that, but I want to, I can't help it. I'm going to continue, though. So remarkable things, Caesar also knew a good deal about PR and what we call performance. He used to always adjust his toga before he would speak. And I think that's, he was, and what happened to him? Because the guy got assassinated by one of his closest friends and confidants, and there were a lot of signals that Caesar wasn't picking up. Listen to these. First of all, the play opens, and this blind seer shouts, "Beware of the Ides of March." That's the way the play opens. And the night before he goes out to the amphitheater and gets assassinated, his wife Calpurnia had a dream. The dream was remarkable because it was a statue of Caesar with about 100 fountains, all of them spouting blood, which lusty Romans were there to bathe their arms in. Can you imagine? And then a lion ran through the street. A howl hooted, an owl hooted. There was thunder and lightning, always a bad omen for Romans. And most of all, his most trusted assistant, Artemidorus, tries to get Caesar to read a letter he had written that morning of the assassination, which said, "Caesar, beware of Brutus. Take heed of Cassius. Come not near Casca." He begs him 3 times. Like Caesar's running off to a meeting, and there is, the Artemidorus, trying to say, "Why don't you read this, Caesar?" And Caesar says, "Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that later." I thought just to remember all of these signals. Now, what's going on is Caesar. What happened? Now, I want to assure you that the answer, dear friends, is not in the stars. What didn't he want? I mean, the question that strikes me about what is going on in leadership, where they seem to have that inability. I don't know where that fits into the 7 character, those 7. But I think in some ways it has a little bit of, I don't know where you would put it, but we're going to get to that later. It's got to have it's hubris. It's a kind of arrogance where, when I was in the Middle East several years ago, they talked about people who don't listen as having, I love this phrase, tired ears. Isn't that great? Tired ears. So, let me bring it up to date and talk about Mr. Raines. Raines also was a good man and an extraordinary leader. I mean, 7 Pulitzers that year, 6 of them for the coverage of the fallout of 9/11. Quite remarkable. But it's the Caesar story once again, and in a more dramatic way because it's been made more public. And the question that really puzzles me, and I really, in a way, it's a sort of a joke in the way of phrasing it, but what didn't they know? And when didn't they want to know it? And it's a puzzling question, and it seems to be one of the sort of streams or currents that goes through, I think, the story of failed, or using Barbara's book title, Bad Leadership. Okay, I'm going to try to explore this a little bit with you. On June 6th, Ken Oleta, who was visiting here this week, and we stopped in to see him just for a little while, wrote an article, a long profile of Mr. Raines, in the New Yorker on June 6th, 2002. It's a 17,000-word piece. It's quite remarkable. The first paragraph reads like this. A man who takes the subway wearing the white Panama hat of a plantation owner is either blithely arrogant or irrepressibly self-confident. And in the 9 months that Howell Raines has been the executive editor of the Times, both qualities have been imputed to him. New Yorker, June 6, 2002. I was repeatedly struck by how shocked Mr. Raines was when he apparently did some interviewing of his nearby staff, because there was a lot of, as David said, a lot of clamor by the people, especially in the newsroom. And I should say that I was deeply shocked to learn that he seemed to not know about it. He said, only in the last few days has this negative view of me come to my eyes. Now, you know and I know that that's not true. I mean, can you imagine, would anybody not have read the piece in the New York Times, the Sunday Times 2 weeks ago about who was on the staff of, let's say, Larry Summers, who didn't read that article? Do you think Larry Summers did not? What is this? And all the things that were later said about him, he said, I now understand. I wonder what's going on. So what is going on here? Why is it that leaders seem to self-destruct with their tired ears? For example, recently, critics have long warned about the possible failure of the power grid that occurred in a lot of, not in Boston, but in lots of the Midwest and the Northeast. What about didn't Jack Welch know that when he tried to acquire Honeywell, he would have to do more than chat up Mario Monti at the European Union and go to Brussels at least? He felt, as long as I can get Mario Monti to call me Jack, it'll be a deal. What was going on here? What about the recent Columbia shuttle disaster? Didn't we get some signs about that? With the earlier shuttle disaster? Weren't just some things known that should have been? What about 9/11 and connecting the dots? Well, here are some of the explanations. Imperious arrogance, cognitive dissonance, not wanting to see things that don't confirm what you want to believe, underestimating the significance of dangerous inflection points, simply unable to listen. What about the culture? Does it encourage speaking up, truth to power? All of these things get in it. Part of it is character issues of the leader herself or himself who doesn't want to get the news. Part of it may be the inability to abandon your ego to the talents of others who are telling you things that contradict your point of view, or maybe for the good of the organization, but you don't want to listen to. There's so many things going into that stew that leads to these tired ears. I want to end with a sad coda, and to me, perhaps one of the most interesting ones. I hope I can explain it as well as I'd like to. The sad coda is this. It's again, Caesar was a good man. Howell Raines was a good man. That's what makes his figure a bit Shakespearean, because he was a terrific editor. And the ideas that Howell Raines believed in and fought for, internationalizing the paper, nationalizing the paper, all of those things have been adopted by his successor, Bill Keller, who is a man who can engage the people in a way that Howell never could. And I think the sad part of it is that all those ideas, had Raines been able to build those coalitions earlier on, had he been able to listen, I'm sorry. I think I better end with that. I think